All right, hello everyone. Can you hear me? All right, hi. So first thing, my name's Mindy. I'm a GSI for this course, in case you haven't met me. Number two is there will be a couple of discussion points in this lecture, so if you could please sit next to somebody that you could talk to. I'll give you a couple minutes now to readjust your seating. Okay, so thanks for coming to lecture today. This is going to be a largely not technical, just mostly conceptual overview about bat echolocation. And this is just intended to give you a look at some applications for some of the signal processing tools that you've been learning that might not be typical for what you would consider in the field. So first question, before we can talk about echolocation, what is sonar? Would somebody like to tell me a little bit about sonar? Yeah? Yes, okay, so on a very basic level, hi everyone, we're talking about sonar. So sonar is when you send out sound pulses, and then they bounce off objects in the environment, and they're then received, and you can process some of the signals that you get back to try to figure out things about your environment. So of course distance is one thing that you can look at based on how long it takes for the echo to come back from whatever sound you've sent out. There's a lot more information you can get as well out of phase shifts and also depending on the shape of the sonar pulses. So in theory, of course, this is a very nice simple schematic. Thank you, Wikipedia. In practice, it's much more complicated. You have lots of environmental factors. You have lots of reflective things like water surface, if you're a submarine, for example. And this can make sonar processing actually a very complicated signal processing application. But again, we're going to be focusing on animals today. So here's just a few examples of animals that use sonar of some kind, so biosonar, as it's called. So we have some underwater animals. We have a beaked whale near the top and also famously dolphins. Fun fact, dolphins actually send their sounds out the forehead because they have this organ called the melon that allows them to direct the sound beam. There's a couple types of birds that live in caves that also produce clicking sounds that they use for echolocation, although the clicks are actually made with their wings, which is pretty fascinating. And there's also some species of shrews that echolocate. But the masters of echolocation are bats. There are about 1,300 species of bats. Now, not all of them echolocate, but most of them do. So roughly, you can think of bats as being divided into two camps. And the first are the bats that look like dogs. And the second are the bats that do not look like dogs. So the bats the megabats, as they're called, the dog-like ones, of those bats, there's only one species that echolocates, and it does so using tongue clicks. So that's lingual echolocation that you use with your tongue, and that's these ones, I guess, on the left. So those are Egyptian fruit bats. And the rest of the bats that echolocate use what's called laryngeal echolocation, and that means that they voice their calls. So they are literally flying around screaming at a very high amplitude to be able to sense their environments. Now, another random fun fact, bats can produce sound at such a loud amplitude that many of them actually dislocate their eardrums while they're echolocating to prevent themselves from becoming deaf. This is how crazy bats are. So echolocation calls actually vary a lot by species. So here's a typical example of a call from an insect hunting bat, a very small one. It's about this large, weighs like a couple of grams, commonly found in California, the California myotis. So I don't know how many spectrograms you've been looking at in this class, but you can see along the x-axis we have time, and then we have frequency up on the y-axis. And essentially what's been done here is a Fourier transform has been taken for blocks of 256 samples and then scanned down the length of a recorded call to give you this nice plot of frequency over time. So what you can see immediately from this is that bats call at frequencies that are well above human hearing range. So humans can hear from about 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. Most bats call well above 20 kilohertz. This one is sweeping up. There's a problem with the axes here. I made a mistake. But it sweeps up to about 120 kilohertz, this particular call. And the highest calling bats call at 212 kilohertz. Very, very high. So this bat has a very fast, what we call a frequency modulated call. So it sweeps from top to down in about 3.5 milliseconds. Some bats have much longer calls. that stay more or less at the same frequency. Now what you're seeing with these replicates are actually harmonics. So harmonics can also be used for echolocation. And on the bottom we have an example of, this is a fruit bat that has a sweeped call and some very prominent harmonics in it. So already there's a lot of variation. But why do these calls vary so much? Well, we'll get into that in 1 second. First, we're going to go through the formal classification for these calls. So again, I mentioned we have frequency modulated, constant frequency, and then tongue clicks. All right, so discuss with your neighbor 1 minute. If you have an outgoing sonar signal X of t, what would you do to determine whether a measured signal Y of t contained a reflected echo of X of t? Talk 1 minute. $15 seconds. Okay, let's bring it back to the front, please. What were some of the ideas you had for how you would find that echo? Hint, you've learned it in this class. I hope. It's okay, there's probably multiple ways to solve this problem, so. Yeah? Okay, so we have an idea of taking a correlation. So how many other people talked about maybe taking a correlation of some kind? Yeah, we have a few. Were there any other ideas? Okay, so find the transfer function of what? Yeah, you would measure Y of t. So you would send out, you would know what signal X of t you send out, and then you would measure some signal Y of t that was reflected back from the environment. Yeah. So if you have some knowledge about the environment, then you could try to find some sort of model for how the environment is distorting your echoed signal. And with that model, you might be able to figure out where the echo is in the call. All right, so the idea that I was thinking of specifically was indeed the cross-correlation. So what you would do is, ideally, in a world where you have no noise, then when you send out a sound and it bounces back to you, then the reflected echo looks exactly like the original call. So when you cross-correlate the two signals, the one you've sent out and the one that you measure, you should end up with some very strong peak in your cross-correlation around the time where the echo came back. And from that time, then you can start to analyze the distances and other kinds of information that you can get out of a sonar pulse. So one thing to note is that the peakiness of a cross-correlation depends very critically on the shape of the echolocation pulse. So as an example, we just saw some of the different kinds of calls that bats have. If you have a rectangular pulse that you send out, so it would just be like a square wave, and then you would stop, wait for a while, another square, stop, then you end up with a very triangular cross-correlation. If you have a frequency-swept one, so in this case going from low frequencies to high frequencies, you actually get a much, much sharper autocorrelation, which is why some of these bats sweep so many frequencies, because they get very good time resolution. Because if there's any corrupting noise, it's still fairly obvious where the peak is, and therefore they can be sure that what they're hearing back is actually the reflected echo of their own call. And there are some bats that call, as we saw, at a constant frequency, and this produces a very, very messy autocorrelation. But the good thing about calling at a constant frequency is that you can get velocity information through the Doppler shift We're going to return to the Doppler shift in a little while. But we're going to talk also a little bit about what design parameters there are for bat calls. So of course you can sweep a frequency, but you can do a lot more things than that. So bats can vary the duration of their pulses. They can vary the amount of time between pulses. They can vary the range of frequencies that they sweep. They can vary the number and amplitude of the harmonics. And at least in this case, which in what's called a hockey puck call, they can also vary the placement of the knee, as it's called. And you can see it's pointed out where the slope changes a little bit in the frequency. And the relative slopes can also be varied, depending on the environment. So why might bats need to change their calls so much? Or what might they need to consider? Well, one, sound attenuates very quickly in air, and high frequencies attenuate a lot more quickly than low ones. So you can detect targets much farther away if you're calling at a lower frequency than if you're calling at a high one. But on the flip side, you can really only detect prey items that are roughly the same size as the wavelength of the thing you're sending out, or slightly larger. So if you call at only low frequencies, you might miss very small insects that you'd like to catch just because the wavelength of the sound is too long. So once you're actually approaching prey, it's probably a good idea to have some high frequency components. Here's something that might not matter so much for generating sonar in a submarine, but the energy cost of sound production is phenomenal for these animals that are this size that call as loudly as a jackhammer. I mean, they're flying, right? They're using a ton of energy just to fly, and then to be screaming nonstop on top of that is a lot of energy. And you could have some kind of ambient noise. So maybe in some sort of urban environment, there could be a disturbance at a frequency that you would usually like to call. So it's probably good if you can shift the frequency of your call a little bit away from that frequency so that you don't have as much distortion when you're listening to the return echoes. We'll also return to this point a little bit later in the talk. And lastly, environmental clutter can be a huge challenge for bats. So especially ones that hunt in the forest where there's tons of leaves everywhere, you can have all sorts of reflective surfaces. And if you're trying to pinpoint a particular target, then you might get echoes back from things that are not your target, and you might mistake them for your target of interest. So right now what I've shown you is just kind of a little bit of a hypothesis, right? That maybe something like environmental clutter affects how bats shape their calls. In fact, it's empirically observed that it does. So here's a plot of some different kinds of bats alongside the places where they live. And the bats, except for this bat on the very far left, the ones that live in the cluttered areas tend to call with frequency sweeps. The ones that live in open spaces tend to call with more constant frequency. And ones that live on the boundaries can also change their calls so that they can accommodate either the forest or the open space. As another fun bat fact note, this bat on the bottom right is actually fishing. So those bats will call extraordinarily loudly because most of the energy will reflect off the surface of the water instead of off their prey. But they can detect ripples, they can detect a hair sticking out of the water, and then they'll stick their claws down in and catch a fish or whatever it is that they can find there. So one thing to think about is that we looked at a cross-correlation for trying to find an echo. But cross-correlations don't have a huge amount of information about clutter. So there is a slightly more informative metric that we can use to try to consider how clutter might affect a bat's perception. And that's something called the ambiguity function. Okay, so I don't expect you to really internalize everything in these equations, but I'm putting them up here just so that if you decide to look up the ambiguity function later, because in case this interests you, then you'll be able to find it. So this is essentially a way of capturing information on how likely it is that clutter will be mistaken for a target of interest. And essentially what it is some sort of cross-correlation that takes into account that the returning echo is distorted by the Doppler shift, because a bat will be flying. So the reason that this is the wideband ambiguity function is that different frequencies are affected differently by the speed at which you're traveling. So if you are calling at many, many frequencies, then the pulse is going to be really distorted. It won't be uniformly distorted in frequency by the Doppler shift. Now, if you're calling at more or less the same frequency or at a very narrow band, then you can kind of pretend that the distortion will be the same across all of the frequencies, and you end up with this nice narrow band ambiguity function. So the compression terms that we had in the previous one now simplify to just this exponential that nicely has frequency and an imaginary component and time in it. And you can see actually that if you fix the time delay for when the echo comes back, then this is actually just a Fourier transform of a couple of different signals multiplied together. So why does this say anything about clutter? Well, again, conceptually, you can think about this as like a series of cross correlations. And the one at 0 is what we were thinking of originally, where there was no Doppler distortion. We just had a pulse that came out and came back, and then we were looking for a peak. And now, at different values of the Doppler shift, we can see, do we actually, in fact, have a nice peak that will help us locate where the echo came back? And you might not have one, or you might have many, depending on the shape of the pulse. So here we can see the rectangular pulse has, again, it had that triangle shape at the 0 Doppler shift slice, and then it has some side lobes going out as there are different relative velocities between target and bat. We have a slightly sharper one for the linear frequency modulated sweep, and then we have a series of these bizarre peaks that are sometimes referred to as the nail bed for just a constant frequency pulse. And essentially what each of these other little peaks or side lobes are, they represent the locations and speeds of objects that could be mistaken for the object of interest if they're particularly large. So kind of conceptually, broadly, these are the locations of different things that if you have a ton of stuff in your environment and you're trying to hunt one particular object, those are the places that you could put other objects that you would then mistake for your target of interest. And so we can use this to measure how clutter might affect bat perception. So bats, in addition to having variable calls across species, also actively vary their calls while hunting. So are there any guesses as to why calls might change in this particular way shown here, where the closer that you get to a target, the more frequently the calls come and the wider the bandwidth? Any hypotheses? Yeah? Yes, absolutely. So as you need more accuracy, as things are moving quickly, then you might want more time resolution, so you might call more frequently. And there's an idea down here also. Yep. So that's a couple of hypotheses. Any more? Well, researchers are still trying to figure this out, so if you have any, then let me know. Okay, so now we're going to take 5 minutes to return to your favorite topic of the Z-transform. So you can either work on this with somebody next to you, or you can sit down and write it yourself. But I encourage you to take the next 5 minutes to work on this problem. Then I'll show you very briefly the answers, but they should be on the webcast in case you need to look them up in more detail. So we'll take a little time now. So how many people have done one? Have done part A? You have some people have part A. Okay, how many have part B? A couple fewer. Have anyone gotten to part C? How about we give it a little more time? I think we might have to wait a while for course evaluation people to show up. So. So we've had a request to go over part A. Would anyone like to talk me through part A? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what would I put? Okay, what was the 2075? Is that it? Okay. Should there not be? Yeah. Maybe there's not. Yeah, you're right. Thanks. Okay. So we would repeat z minus whatever the length of the radius is, something e to the j 2 pi times, etc. Yep. Okay. So that would give my zeros in the numerator. And then the same thing for the one pole in the denominator. So 0 minus, what is that? 0.995 e to the j2 pi point, whatever that is. Yeah. Does everyone agree with this? Okay. So now how about part B? What do we get for part B? You don't have to simplify the expression at all, by the way. So you can also just tell me what you would substitute. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Okay. So for part B, we put C here, some normalizing constant. And then all of the places we have Z, we put e to the j omega, e to the j omega, etc. Okay. So part C. What do we do for part C? Well, first of all, how do you relate normalized frequency to the sampling frequency? Sorry? Divide by, okay, so that's like angular frequency versus, okay. So, sorry, you've answered a few, so I'm going to see if I can get anyone else to talk. How do I get my normalized frequency in terms of the sampling frequency? Divide by fs. Okay, so this would be 2 pi, the actual frequency, and fs is the sampling frequency, so does everyone agree? Okay. All right, so now this is a matter of multiplying out some numbers, right? So has anyone multiplied those out? Can you tell me where the zeros and poles are? Or can somebody tell me what I should plug in here if I want to find? I'll give you a hint. I'm looking for F at the zeros and poles. Yeah? terms, so that omega should be equal to the 2 pi times those things, right? Yes. Yes. Yeah, so that. Okay. Yeah, so has anybody calculated this? Would anyone like to calculate these, or should I just write it down? Should I just write it down? Okay. We're about to get to the interesting part of this problem. All right. So the zeros are at 41.5 and 85 and 100 kilohertz. And the one pole (83 kilohertz). All right, so for the next part of this problem, we wanted to try to just sketch the transfer function, right, which is actually 1 minus the g that I've had you calculate. So, should I do it on that board? Yeah. All right, so I'm going to put frequency in kilohertz on this axis. Somebody guide me through an approximation of this plot. Where should I have maxima, minima? Yeah. Okay. All right, so I should have my maximum somewhere at 83 kilohertz. It's a plot of H. Okay, so it should be really low. All right, how many people think that there's a notch at 83? Yeah, few. How many think that it's a max? Okay, let's go with a notch then. Okay. All right, what other features do I have on this transfer function plot? Yeah? Okay. So yeah, we'll just assume this is some kind of log. I'm going to do this very roughly. So can you tell me those numbers? Okay, so 45, 41.5, 85, and 100. Okay. All right, and in between that, roughly, how do I expect this to look? Yeah, let's just approximate. Okay. So here's approximately what this plot looks like. So we can see that this is approximately the transfer function for the hearing of this bat. And what we see is that it doesn't very strongly receive any signals around 83 kilohertz. And it slightly more strongly gets ones at 41.5 and then a little bit higher frequency than 83. So as it turns out, this bat is a constant frequency echolocating bat. And it calls at around 83 kilohertz or so. But the Doppler shift causes returning signals to be a little bit higher at around 85 kilohertz or so. So this bat's auditory system is tuned intrinsically to ignore the calls at the frequency that it's sending out and to amplify the ones at the frequency that they're coming back. So does that make sense? Yeah? How's it experimentally determined? Yeah, so some of the work you can do like anatomically, you can try to look at the shape of the bat, and then if you sculpt like a head of the bat, then you can try to figure out how some of the frequencies are fiddled around. Some of it you just look at neural responses. So a lot of in these bats, they actually have very well organized clusters of neurons that respond to different frequencies and then also to different time delays. So if you can monitor, in this particular study I was referencing, they went into the bats' brains, then they put some electrodes into the different neurons, and they looked at which ones fired when they played different frequencies at different amplitudes. And this was the response based on the neural firing. Yeah. Okay, cool. So phased arrays are, just switching gears just a little bit, phased arrays are a way of steering. Do you have a question? No? Okay. So phased arrays are employed in submarines and in civilian and military applications, and they're a way of shaping sonar beams. So this is a way of sending out your sonar signals into some direction that you would like them to go that isn't necessarily straightforward from the array. And the way that you do this is that you send sound out at the same frequency but at a slightly different phase. Perfectly tuned so that you end up with this nice wavefront of equal phase, and that's roughly the direction in which you're sending the sound signal. So if you can change, for example, the phases at which you're sending things out at different points in time, and then you can sweep around different areas. So some kind of recent exciting study was conducted on those bats that I told you used their tongue clicks for echolocation. And they found that actually the jaws of these bats act as a kind of phase array. So essentially the bats will click their tongues against the inside of their teeth, and then the little spaces between their teeth act as all the different little point sources. And based on how they move their tongues around on the inside of their mouths, then they can shape their beams, the beams of their calls. What's even cooler is that they can also do it a little bit individually by frequency. So they can have high frequencies be in one particular location and the lower frequencies just a little bit farther away, and then they can distinguish even more information out of their returning echoes than just the location of the beam based on whether the returning echo came back at a higher or a lower frequency. So despite the fact that they're not able to shape their calls by doing such frequency sweeps or constant frequency, they can still extract a lot of information about the environment. And again, I imagine this would be a very complicated and interesting problem to implement in an engineering perspective. So bats are very social animals. You've probably all seen pictures of bat colonies somewhere. How might this pose a problem for bat echolocation? So I'm going to wait. Yeah. Did we have someone up? Okay. Yes, exactly. So this is something that we call jamming. It's also sometimes called the cocktail party problem, and it's especially difficult for bats because other bats that are, again, calling very loudly might be calling with a really similar pulse to their own, and so the bats don't want to mistake calls from other bats as echoes that are coming back to them. So bats do have some ways of avoiding jamming. And one of them involves trying to separate their calls in the frequency domain, and the other way involves separating them in the time domain. So for comparison here, we have a schematic of some echolocating bats as compared to some weakly electric fish. So these weakly electric fish use something called electrolocation, where they generate a local electric field by just kind of pulsing some of their electrical organs, and then they have electrical sensors all along their bodies so that they can figure out when something has disturbed it. And these fish can jam each other, but when they come near enough to each other, then generally, consensus-wise, one of them will start to pulse at a little bit of a higher frequency and one at slightly lower, so then they have less spectral overlap. And it's been hypothesized that bats will do the same thing, that they might widen the distance between their calls when they come near each other. And alternatively, for the fish that don't have a constant frequency, and they have very sharp pulses, they have also been documented to adjust the time at which they're pulsing so that they can distinguish more or less when the echoes are coming back or when objects are there. And the same thing has been hypothesized for the bats. So it turns out this is actually a really difficult study to conduct empirically with the bats, because if the bats are flying, then of course you can get Doppler shifts when you're trying to measure return echoes. So there was a paper that tried to show that, yes, bats would shift their frequencies up to avoid jamming, but then it turned out that they were actually just flying too fast at the microphone, and there wasn't actually a frequency shift at all. So this is also an ongoing area of research. What's been shown most definitively is that bats will lower the amplitude of their calls when they're around each other. Also, contrary to popular belief, bats are not blind, so they do have decent vision, and if they're in a crowded place, then they might decide to rely on that or on ambient noise instead of on calling at all in order to navigate. So another fun fact, I did some research on this as an undergraduate, actually using the ambiguity function that I showed you earlier. So if you want to talk about undergrad research experiences, I would be very happy to share. So bats, in addition to unintentionally jamming each other, can have intentional sources of jamming. So in a beautiful series of experiments conducted here on big brown bats, it was found that there's a species of moth that actually produces ultrasonic clicks that will jam bat echolocation. And these are called tiger moths. There's many different types of tiger moths, but there's one specific genus that is capable of doing this. And bats' success at catching prey is almost 10 times reduced when these moths are clicking. And they're the only insects that are known to actively avoid bat hunting. It's also found that some bats are kind of nasty, and they like to jam their compatriots. So here we have some Mexican free-tailed bats, and you can see in the spectrogram we have the normal search phase pulses in the background, and then suddenly, once this bat starts to narrow in on a prey item, we have some other bat that comes in and makes this sinusoidal in the spectral domain type noise. So that's equivalent to the bat basically going over the top of the other bat's call to prevent it from being able to catch insects. Pretty mean. So again, I am the bat aficionado. Also, in case this picture has not convinced you that you need to move to Colorado, then nothing will. When I was in high school, I used to monitor bats for the local city open space and mountain parks. And what that meant is that 2 nights a month, I would go out and sit by a pond around sunset, and I would pull out a bat detector. And because it's really hard to actually see the bats, then this bat detector would in real time have to let me hear the bats that were flying around. Now again, because they were calling at too high a frequency for me to actually hear, I needed this device in order to tell whether they were there. So take 2 minutes to discuss with your neighbor. You'd like to listen to some bat calls, but your hearing viewing range can't detect them. What do you do if you have to do this in real time? Which basically means you can't just record it and play it back slower. 2 minutes. All right, take 15 seconds. Okay, so what are your suggestions for tackling this problem? Again, there's many ways that this has been addressed, so feel free. Yep. Okay. Yep, so apply some kind of frequency shift, and how would you do that? Okay, yeah, so we have a suggestion to multiply by an complex exponential or by some sort of oscillator, some sort of oscillating signal in the time domain to bring this down to an audible frequency. Are there other suggestions? No? Okay. So in the bat detector world, this is called heterodyning. It's really just modulating by a cosine, but heterodyning is the terminology that's used. And we have the addition here, instead of just shifting everything down, you also band pass afterwards so that you can try to filter out some of the ambient noise. So heterodyning has some challenges. For one, you have to tune the frequency by which you're modulating, so you can miss calls that are not centered at a certain place. So again, because bats have such variable calls, you might have many bats in one area, and some might be calling at 50 kilohertz, and some maybe are calling at 100. And if you've only tuned your frequency shifting to 50 kilohertz, you might miss the fact that there are bats at 100 kilohertz. So one way to address this problem is to use what's called a comb spectrum generator. And in that case, you just have a ton of cosines that are all at different frequencies, and you try to kind of shift simultaneously a ton of different frequencies down into the same band. Now, if you're not careful, you can end up with a ton of spectra that are overlapping each other and you won't hear anything useful. But if it's a quiet night, then maybe you'll get lucky. So something else people do, instead of just modulating directly down into hearing range, is something called super heterodyning, where you first modulate something way high up or way low down, and you do some processing on it, and then bring it back after processing at an intermediate frequency to the frequency range that you actually want. And unfortunately, this can generate some problems called image responses, as they're called. And essentially what that is that if you imagine that you have some call, so here it's green, that's the thing that you're interested in, and you want to bring it down to a frequency where you can hear it. So that's the center one in the bottom part. That's where the red filter is centered. Then unfortunately you can get, because you're shifting by a sinusoid that has a higher frequency than the frequency that you're interested in, then things that are also higher than that frequency, because these are all real signals, will get replicated across the spectrum. They'll reflect across the x-axis, and you'll end up with overlap. So you can have two signals that are separated higher up by some specific amount, and they'll overlap once you've modulated everything down. So that's another problem you have to deal with in this case. So last of all, I'll just say that not all bat calls are echolocation. Bats have a pretty rich repertoire of social communication calls. So here's just an example of some of the syllables, as they're called, that bats use when they're talking to each other. Bats have also been found to have individually distinct calls that allow them to distinguish each other purely by their voices. Now, this is another interesting signal processing problem. Just how different do any two calls have to be in order for you to be able to tell that one of them belongs to one bat and one to another? And how different do they have to be if you have 1,000 bats? Something to consider. And also, mothers' bats use sound and smell to find their baby bats. So here we have an image. This is actually a nice video if you want to go watch it on National Geographic, where this mother bat has landed in a nursing colony where there's dozens and dozens of pups, and she needs to find which one is her own. So she basically just crawls over all of the other young ones until she can both smell and hear her pup, and then stops. So biosonar, as I've talked about today, is just a subfield of bioacoustics. So again, bioacoustics is the study of animal sounds, and it can use a lot of very sophisticated signal processing to try to understand how animals perceive sound, and also how much information might intrinsically be encoded in that sound. It has a lot of uses for wildlife monitoring and conservation, if you could automatically detect what kinds of animals have been recorded. And I would encourage any of you who are interested in animals and signal processing to take a look at some different animal spectrograms sometime. that's all I have. Thank you for listening. I think we probably have 15 minutes until... We might have 15 minutes until the course evaluators show up, so I hope you don't mind entertaining yourself or asking questions for a little while. Yes? It's possible because those bats eat fruit, but they have fairly sharp-looking teeth that aren't strictly necessary for it. So those are actually the species of bat that I worked with, and they can't actually bite through anything. They, but yeah, they do have sort of sharp teeth. Yeah, it's just, well, as soon as you put on a little leather glove, they just can't penetrate it. So literally what would happen is I would pick up a bat, and then it would freak out, and then it would start to try to bite me. It would gnaw for about a second, and then be like, meh, I can't get through this, and then it would leave me alone. So that's